I think
Would you
someone
just say
has
it's just like a different quality of experience, but there's no actual value judgment between the two options?
or less. I mean, obviously, you put me in a very difficult position. It makes me sound like I have no opinions about whether people should be Nazis or not.
Well, I
But
think it's a problem with your. I think it's a legitimate problem with your belief system. I think you put yourself in this position. You are tuning in to the Multiversity, a podcast for higher dimensional education.
join us as we explore philosophy, science, history, and the great unknown.
Welcome to the Multiversity. We've got a very special episode for you today. We're going to be talking about the meaning crisis in the modern world. Because so many people today don't know what to believe or why they should believe anything at all. More importantly, we're also going to be talking about what you can do about it. I'm Ariel.
I'm Katie.
I'm Chris.
I'm Kurt, and I love meaning.
So do I, Kurt. So do I. So the four of us have gone through the first 9 lectures of John Vervaeke's course, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. In this course, he does a historical survey of the roots of the meaning crisis while drawing out tools he thinks might be useful in addressing it. It's an awesome course, and Vervaeke is an awesome guy, and we highly, highly recommend it to all of you. So, the meaning crisis. We as a society are currently in the middle of a massive meaning crisis. What does this mean? Before we understand the meaning crisis, we have to understand what came before it. In past societies, people lived within systems of meaning that their societies provided. Like, for example, before the Enlightenment, the Western world lived within the meaning system of Christianity. For long periods of time, China lived within the meaning system of Confucianism. Middle Eastern societies, like the Ottoman Empire and empires that came before, lived within the Islamic meaning system, and so on and so forth. And these meaning systems were divided into sub-meaning systems, but you get the idea. So these systems both unified societies and helped people live together in a cohesive way and allowed individuals to live their lives with a sense of purpose. So now on to the modern meaning crisis. Our society today lacks such a unifying system. Instead, we have a multitude of contradictory belief systems floating around, like, for give a few examples, neo-Buddhism, anarcho-socialism, Marxism, voluntarism, Scientology, so on. There's dozens, too many to count. So a modern individual has to choose what to believe, basically, but there aren't any real guidelines for how to make that choice. There's no meta-meaning system. A lot of individuals respond to this by either picking one meaning system and becoming dogmatically attached to it, by living lives of apathy and alienation and angst, or by embracing nihilism, which is a meaning system where you deny all meaning. Oddly enough. So the social consequences of this are devastating. Mental health problems are on the rise. Our societies are locked in ideological struggle. Bullshit is proliferating, and bullshit is an intellectual term. And many people feel their lives are meaningless and empty. So we're going to start by talking about the meaning crisis. What do you guys think? Is this really a thing?
Yeah, it does seem to be a thing. I mean, it's kind of hard to say because it feels like its roots go back to since before I can remember, really. I mean, I feel like I've just kind of grown up in this meaning crisis. And so for me, it seems like no more of a crisis than usual, although maybe the interconnectedness of the world as a result of the internet is making it seem like it's coming to this sort of fever pitch where, people just have no idea what to think about things. And a lot of people are becoming depressed and anxious, and they don't really know what to do with themselves. So I definitely agree that that's a thing.
I agree that it's a thing. Like Chris said, it's kind of hard to pin down because, being the age that I am, I feel like it's always been a thing also. But I do feel like society at large doesn't have a unifying philosophy, kind of as you were talking about. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's good that we are at a place where we were kind of questioning religion, questioning gender roles, questioning nationalism, questioning all these institutions that kind of held society together for a while. I think that's good and shows intellectual growth. But then on the flip side, I feel like a lot of people have no sense of purpose in life, and it can be seen almost as strange to be looking for one, or to be talking about this notion of purpose sometimes. And I think that leaves people pretty lost.
Yeah, I think it is a thing, but it's hard to say exactly when it started, because I'm sure a lot of people have been having questions for a very long time, but it's like now a lot of regular people have more of a voice, so it becomes more apparent. So I'm sure there's been people questioning things, but now we can see it clearly. So it's also about this information overload. So like you were talking about, Ariel, there's so many different ideologies or so many different religions to choose from. That's part of it. There's also even things that we might not consider ideologies, like perspectives of the media being pushed on us and alternative media that we can choose from. And it's hard to make sense of so much information. Whereas in the past, maybe you just go to church and say, well, what the pastor says sounds pretty good, and I want to be a good person. So everything is comparatively simple, but now it's not like that. So there's a lot of stuff that we keep asking.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying, Kurt, because it reminds me of Nietzsche, because Nietzsche was one of the first people to identify this meaning crisis, and he talked about the death of God, which is this idea that kind of what we were talking about, like what you're talking about, like in the past, in the Middle Ages, the default unified system was Christianity for people in the West. And it was like virtually everyone believed it. And if you didn't, you were kind of a very marginal person in society. And what happened was with the Enlightenment, you get all these like scientific worldview, and the scientific worldview led a lot of people to kind of start questioning Christianity. So it's not like everyone just stopped being Christian at once, but in Nietzsche's time in the 1900s, a lot of intellectuals were questioning it, and it became kind of, being Christian kind of became an optional thing, whereas before it was a pretty mandatory thing. And I think kind of with what you're saying, Kurt, like in the modern day, that's kind of spread to the masses. Like in Nietzsche's time, probably your average person would still have been very likely to be Christian, but today, your average person is now facing what intellectuals were facing back then. Now all of us, we're faced with a variety of meaning systems, and they all seem pretty optional.
Yeah, I think the maybe downside of having this lack of a meaning system, as you put it, is that there's a lack of a narrative. And I think narratives are very important. They're the lens that we filter our world through. And if everybody shares the same narrative in a society, then the society is going to generally interpret events that happen in a similar way. And so the society will have more of a sort of psychological coherence to it. Whereas now, as Kurt mentioned, with all this alternative media and, now it's just, there's the right and the left, and there's foreign actors who are influencing the narrative, and there's just all of these different narratives that are being pushed. And so the general public is just confused. They just don't know which narrative to follow, because a lot of these narratives, of course, are mutually exclusive, and they can't both be true at the same time. So yeah, it causes a lot of psychological conflict.
Yeah, I wanted to note here that still, like in the US anyway, still 75% of the population self-identifies as Christian. So when we're going around like thinking that the vast majority of people are like not so many, there isn't a majority ideology, there still kind of is, but definitely in academia and in the media and in like circles that we might be moving around in, I think it's much, much less dominant.
Yeah, I think it definitely depends which country you're in. Like in Canada, I don't know what the statistics are, but it would certainly be a lot less than that. And in Western Europe, it would be as well. Mm-hmm. So I think it depends where you are. Also in the United States, there's a lot of different kinds of Christianity. So it's like the part of the Enlightenment was the Reformation, where before the Reformation, if you're a Christian in the West, you were a Roman Catholic, basically. And after the Reformation, Christianity itself splintered off in all these subtypes of Christianity, which are kind of incompatible. Some of them are compatible with each other. Like maybe if you're, I don't know, two similar types of Protestant, but, you know, a Baptist and a Roman Catholic are going to have a hard time being religious together.
One thing which I'm sure we'll get into later that I think is important to mention is the lack of integration of mystical experiences in English-speaking Western society. So if in the past there were ways to integrate mystical experiences, like if somebody had some weird revelation, there would be some way to try to bring that wisdom into the rest of the tribe or something. But now we don't have that. In fact, it's even denied that things like visions even exist, or they're labeled as mental illness.
Yeah, and I think that sort of belief in the supernatural is one of those things that can provide those really strong sort of peak mystical experiences. And I think that religious services, you know, at least to somebody who believes in all of the things that are happening at the religious service, can be a source for those sort of peak mystical experiences. And I think, yeah, you're just seeing participation in that sort of stuff precipitously decline because people just don't believe in the supernatural anymore. Maybe there are other reasons.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of brings us to our next question, because one thing Vervaeke talks about a lot is shamanism, and it seems to be undergoing kind of a revival right now. Like we're seeing a rise of a kind of neo-shamanism, paganism taking place in the West. So like, how do you guys think that fits in with what we're talking about?
Well, I think that fits in really well with what Kurt was talking about in terms of mystical experiences. Shamanism, how Vervaeke described it, he described it as a set of psychotechnologies for altering your state of consciousness, which enhances your cognition in some way. He's coming from a really secular perspective on it, but he was talking about a shaman is a person who uses techniques like sleep deprivation or long stretches of singing or dancing or chanting, or social isolation, or psychedelics, or imitation, like becoming the deer if you were trying to learn how to hunt, like techniques like this to try to kind of disrupt your normal, like day-to-day state of being and induce one of these mystical experiences or flow state type experiences to kind of expand your consciousness and give meaning and also enhance your cognition.
Yeah, so with there's some interesting articles about this talking about the shamanic view of mental illness, and there's also a fellow who did a TED talk about this. I think his name is Borges, and he talks about how he traveled to different societies and learned the shamans, or got to know the shamans in different societies, and saw how they acted as healers. And the thing was, normally what would happen in the stories around their adolescence, they would have some kind of break in their consciousness, which would call a psychotic break. But in those societies, they don't see it that way. They just say, I see what's happening. You're becoming a healer, or you're becoming a shaman. And this really doesn't happen in the West. So normally people who have these kind of experiences are sent to psychologists, psychiatrists. They're told to take pills. They're told to suppress this kind of weird perspective that they're getting. And this is what it relates to what Vervaeke is talking about, like thinking outside the box. So when you have this break in perspective, when you see your way of seeing outside the box, it gets pushed down and pushed to the side. And so that's why I think a lot of people now look to things like shamanism, because they want to recapture those techniques to get towards meaning and have a different perspective. So like with what Vervaeke was talking about, I noticed I thought about the quote from Terence McKenna where he says, everybody is watching the television. Like the culture is the television. Everybody's watching it. The shaman is the only person who can get behind it and actually fiddle with the knobs and adjust the antenna.
Yeah, like one thing you said before is like our society doesn't really encourage us to think outside the box. Like, I guess I kind of want to question that a bit because it seems to me that our society seems to encourage creativity quite a lot. Like Western society,
Yes.
like it almost seems to pedestalize it. And so how does that square in with this idea that we're not actually encouraged to think outside the box?
Well, it's not that we're not encouraged to think outside the box. I mean, obviously even the expression think outside the box comes from this society, comes from the puzzle that Vervaeke talks about with the nine dots.
Nine dot problem. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's not quite the same thing. So there's creativity within a certain context, but there's not breaking the cultural frame, which is what this kind of experience can do for somebody, and what psychedelics can do for people, and the other techniques that Katie talked about. So yes, creativity is encouraged, but not coloring outside the lines, not so you can break the box to a certain extent, but there are limits.
Yeah, what I would say is lip service is paid to creativity and encouraging creativity. And when you actually go and try to be creative, a lot of times you get beaten down. Yeah.
I would agree with
know.
that. I would agree with that completely. Okay, so creativity is encouraged in some sense. Like I'm thinking back to my time going to school where like teachers would say they want you to be creative, and for creativity they have art class. But then art class is like they give you an assignment where they almost want you to copy or do a certain type of art a lot of the time. And sometimes you have more openness, but it's always within the box of these certain tools that they want you to use in a certain styles of acceptable art. And that's considered creative because you're creating something and engaging in art in some kind of a way. But the kind of creativity that we're talking about with shamanism is like Kurt said, like truly breaking the cultural frame. This kind of reminds me of going back to like our episode on Andy Kaufman and Jim Carrey. Andy Kaufman could be considered kind of a shamanic figure. And like that kind of weirdness is to some extent accepted in our culture if you are able to break through to a certain level of celebrity status. But if you don't meet that threshold, then he could have very, very easily just been considered 100% insane.
Yeah, I think there's an important type of creation that our society discourages, and that is the sort of creative destruction that a lot of like really creative ideas cause. A lot of creative ideas are not necessarily, completely benign, at least as far as the institutions of society are concerned. There is an element of creative destruction happening. But a lot of times that's what's necessary to break the frame and move the society forward.
I mean, I don't know though. Like, still not sure I agree. Like, it seems to me the meaning crisis is the result of our society, like encouraging creative expression and innovative thought to such an extent that those ideas and those creations did undermine the basis of society. Like,
well, to some extent, yeah, maybe. I think that's a good thing. Maybe this is an interesting question. Like, I think that the meaning crisis is, this isn't a positive experience that we're going through now, but I think that the fact that we've questioned these hardline ways of thinking where everyone was kind of living in the same frame is fundamentally a really, really good thing for society and human development. I don't see it as like a problem per se.
I think, Ariel, what you're talking about, I think what you're saying makes sense, but I think there's a couple of distinctions there. So I think it's like you're saying that the meaning crisis is caused by just people saying, oh, well, we're just going to do whatever. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I mean, no, what I'm saying is you guys are kind of saying that like our society is tamping down creativity or tamping down creative destruction, or like, wild thought in such a, and I just don't see it in our society. Like I see it in places like China where children literally are punished for coloring differently from how the teacher tells them to. I think China is a place where that is happening, and you don't see a lot of art coming from China for that reason. There's some, but not as much as from the West. Like I think in the West, you look at like the meaning crisis was in part precipitated by Nietzsche, who wrote very dark, intellectually wild books. Like you see someone like William Burroughs, who literally wrote books while high on heroin, like become famous and rich. You see like Andy Kaufman did become a famous, successful celebrity. I just see in our society, it seems like we have this like almost insatiable hunger for people who do like chop down the things that we believe and who do surprise us and make us feel disoriented and make us question everything. Like it seems like in our society, it's almost part of what runs the engine of this society. So I question this idea that we're tamping it down.
I mean, I would look at what's happening to all of the members of the intellectual dark web as an example of people who thought outside of the box and got punished, at least by the establishment. Now, does our society at large punish that behavior? Clearly not, since a lot of those people are still successful YouTubers and all of that. But I would definitely say that the institutions of our society are very much against breaking the frame. And that's part of the reason why the frame needs to be broken.
What frame are you talking about?
The dominant frame. Yeah.
What's the dominant frame?
It's so hard to see what it is before you break it. That's the challenge with all this.
Yeah, that's a lot of it.
Ariel, I think you had an interesting point though. Like our society does, okay, on the one hand, like we seem to like crave these artists and thinkers who break the frame and they can be launched into extreme fame and notoriety, whether they're loved or hated. But on the other hand, I mean, well, maybe that's not a problem. Maybe that's just part of the process of becoming a frame breaker and it's inevitable. But basically anybody in that position, if you talk to them about their childhood, like they weren't encouraged to be the way that they are. They were highly discouraged from being the way that they are.
So what Katie and Ariel talked about schooling, I remember having a similar experience with my education where the teacher had assigned this certain thing and I kind of went off the tracks, and it was like, think about the perspective of this certain character, and it was like, all right, so this character is a 12-year-old living in Britain during World War II, and I'm like, okay, I think this character is actually a Nazi spy. And I remember my parents went to meet the teacher later, and the teacher had said, well, Kurt is very creative, but he's actually too creative. And this gets at the whole thing. So you can be creative within certain bounds, but if you want to break the box, yeah,
that's exactly what I mean. There is a box, and there will be people who are provoked by your breaking of the box.
I'm not sure that's how it works, though. I almost think it might just be like I think that does happen. Like there is a push towards conventionality in a lot of ways, but it seems like it's almost necessary because like there's like it's, you know, if you become a heroin addict, you're probably not going to become William Burroughs. Like it's only one in many millions of heroin addicts that become William Burroughs. So it kind of makes sense for your parents to discourage you from becoming a heroin addict. And maybe if you do become like William Burroughs number 2, you could look back and be like, parents, it worked out for me. But that doesn't necessarily mean that encouraging kids to become heroin addicts is the right approach.
No, well, it's weird you talk about the heroin addict in that way, as if the being on heroin was an integral part of his being, or
it was a part of his. It was a part of his success. It was a part of his success. He wrote Naked Lunch on heroin, and most of his books are about heroin, about his time as a heroin addict. So it's like it was only through going through that really dark journey that he was able to become a famous and influential and successful writer.
Yes, there's something about what you're saying that doesn't sit right with me, but I'm not sure I can articulate it. But it's also about having a framework in society for Well, it is about this mental illness thing, because there is no framework for when people have a mental illness for the society to learn from them. They're seen as sick. And that's really marginalizing these people who could provide insight, I think.
I think I can articulate the problem with Ariel's argument. I don't think society discouraged William Burroughs from being creative. They discouraged him from being a heroin addict, and he did it anyway. And we're not talking about people who go and do crazy destructive activities in the name of, like, maybe he was planning to write books about heroin all the time, and that was part of his plan, and it was part of his being creative. But I doubt that's what happened. I think it's much more probable that he became a heroin addict, and then maybe he was a writer at the same time or something like that, and then eventually he figured out how to synthesize those things together. But again, I don't think in that case society was trying to prevent him from being creative. I think they were trying to prevent him from becoming addicted to heroin, which is a different thing. We're talking about sometimes, there are certain creative acts that the institutions in society, the people in power, reject because it threatens their power. I don't think William Burroughs did that.
He's definitely is one of a big, Lake and Lunch is banned a lot. I mean, go ahead, Kurt.
Okay. I think perhaps the causality is mixed up in what you're saying. So it's not like you're saying, well, he was a heroin addict, he wrote about heroin, and therefore he's a frame breaker. But I think it might actually work the other way. So I think maybe he was always a creative, expressive person and always a frame breaker. But because of the pressure of the system, he became a heroin addict because he was so alienated from the society. But fortunately, the whatever creative spark he had within him was so irrepressible that even though he became a heroin addict, his work was still recognized.
That sounds much more likely.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know William Burroughs specifically, but like just knowing highly creative, highly box breaking people that I've known in my past, like that story that you just told, Kurt, is like a very common theme in their lives. And some of them, the creative spark survives and they make it through the other end. And then some of them, if you go talk to homeless people on the street, oftentimes they're some of the most insightful, creative people that you'll ever meet.
I kind of feel like you guys want to have it both ways. Like, you're on one hand, you're saying like, well, it wasn't the heroin that did it. But I mean, if you're saying you want creative destruction and our society doesn't encourage creative destruction enough, like, I'm sorry, creative destruction comes with drug use and homelessness and people being mentally ill. And
I didn't say that it doesn't encourage creative destruction. It does encourage creative destruction, and then it tries to kill it when it happens. It does both.
I think we got to get a little bit clear on what we're talking about here, because I don't like, the question isn't whether creative destruction is good or bad. The question is, does our society encourage or allow creative destruction? And
I think a lot of times it's not really up to the society. It has to do with the power of the idea. If the idea is more powerful than the institutions that are already in power, then there's nothing they can do to stop it. And I think it's, those are the ideas that end up changing the world.
I think it's both. Like, you have places like, in Beijing, the government will literally like come to a party, break it up, and drug test every single person. Whereas obviously that can't happen in the West, in the United States, let's say, because there's civil rights. And so in the United States, a lot of people who are creative do drugs, and they go to parties and they don't get drug tested by the police, and they go on to produce art, and many of them also go on to destroy their lives with the drugs. Well,
sure. I definitely China, compared to China, the West encourages creativity a lot more. I'm not disputing that, and I don't think any of us are either.
Well, how would you guys say the West, how do you guys advocate for the West encouraging creativity more than it does? Like, what are your proposals?
I think what Kurt was talking about, how certain societies have a frame for working with mental illness like schizophrenia and depression and bipolar in a way that like the person isn't seen as, I mean, maybe you still want to see the person as sick in some way, but where the person isn't medicated and doesn't have their brain function almost like tamped down so completely so that it meets a more normal standard, but rather you recognize that that person has a different mental system and try to find a role for them where that can be encouraged and worked with would probably be beneficial.
Right. As Kurt said, they say, you're becoming a shaman. And what this takes in order to have that thought and in order to do something positive with it is it takes even more experienced shamans who have already gone through this experience, and they have some path that they can lead the new shaman down.
We do have it a little bit with, like, I see some artists, I'm pretty sure if they were in a different family or in a different school, could have just been seen as schizophrenic and medicated. But I don't think that it's normalized like that.
I mean, I get what you guys are saying, and I think there's some truth to it in some cases of schizophrenia and mental illness, but I also think you guys are totally romanticizing these conditions. And I mean, many people who have schizophrenia are not secretly creative geniuses. Like, many people just have schizophrenia and do need medical help.
So I don't think I'm necessarily saying that all schizophrenics are creative geniuses, but the point is more like there's a message in that. When somebody has that kind of experience, there's something that the society can learn from, either as something that's going to transform the society, or something that's a statement about the society that people might need to pay attention to. So there's that quote, "It's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." And I think there's truth in that. And by noticing the people who we deem as sick, we can see ourselves. So these mentally ill people are like a mirror of society.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's truth in that. I mean, it's probably true that, like, what the mental conditions or mental illnesses that are prevalent at a given time tell us a lot about the state of a society, which is like what Vervaeke was talking about, the meaning crisis, how like anxiety and depression are the most common mental illnesses in our society today.
Yes, exactly. And he specifically talks about how, depression and anxiety are due to a lack of meaning, and meaning comes from, is almost this direct relation to how often you're able to enter the flow state. And shamans are people who are practiced at entering the flow state and commonly get into a flow state. And so they are commonly interacting with the external world, and they're having this cycle of enhanced implicit learning, which is kind of like experiential learning. It's like, it's not the kind of learning that you do in school where we study from books. It's the kind of learning that you can only learn from doing stuff. And so they get really good at getting into this flow channel, right? And then in that process, they encounter meaning, and then they can disperse. They can distribute that meaning to the other members of their society, causing everybody's lives to increase in meaning, and causing everybody to become happier and more satisfied with their lives.
Yeah, and that's maybe where I would like make a distinction, because I don't think that's what's happening with a typical schizophrenic person. And I think maybe it's the same. Maybe there's something similar in like the seed of the schizophrenic and the shaman. Like maybe there's some similar potential there, but it seems like they each represent a development in very different directions. It seems like a lot of that creative energy and like ready, like a mind that's very ready to like project like visions and images onto the outside world, like that can become a very shamanic mind if it's trained in a particular way, like if it follows the upward spiral. But the downward spiral into schizophrenia is very different. And I'm not sure, like once that begins, I think it might be unchangeable or hard to change.
And I think a lot of the reason for the illness is exactly because the society is discouraging the person from having these flow experiences. And that's what causes them to become very unhappy with their lives. And it causes them to, increase in their, in their feelings of pointlessness and anger and resentment. And I think this comes from a lack of freedom. And so that causes them to worsen over time. I think if these people who have these amazing insights, can be guided maybe by other more experienced shamans, then I think that they will experience that upward spiral where they actually contribute to the society, rather than, just being, shut down and abandoned by their society, which I think leads to even worse.
I think maybe some of the problem is that maybe we don't have the cultural infrastructure to facilitate or understand like the potential for an upward spiral from that kind of a seed.
Right, and I think that's what Vervaeke is specifically trying to do with his lecture series on awakening from the meaning crisis, to introduce this kind of framework by which we can, stop the downward spiral, and cause it to shift upward.
Well, I think very little of what Vervaeke is talking about has to do like specifically with the downward spiral of schizophrenia, but.
Well, he does talk about the mental health crisis, which is an important component of the meaning crisis, which is the central theme of the series.
I think the mental health crisis we're going through right now is more related to anxiety and depression than schizophrenia.
Well, I think these things are tied together. So when you start to suppress the psychotics who have this potential for creating a beautiful meaning, and then on the other side, you have these neurotics of people who are depressed and anxious and things. Well, this is like, here's the solution is right there, maybe, but it's being suppressed. And then you have this other symptom, which is just a symptom of the fact that these people are suppressed in general.
Yeah, if you talk to people who are schizophrenic, they are depressed and anxious. Trust me. It's all part of the same cocktail.
Well, I guess I would say that I think that the definitions of schizophrenia and psychosis are unclear, like even in the psychiatric community. If you look at the DSM, it's not entirely clear. And also I think diagnoses tend to kind of shift and change over time. It's really difficult to pin down and make clear exactly what we're talking about, because I don't think that anybody knows exactly what we're talking about. We're picking up on a lot of common behaviors and experiences that are grouped together in certain ways, and tend to follow certain patterns and trends. I have looked at some research that schizophrenic minds, one characteristic of them is you have regions of the brain that usually don't communicate so much, that communicate a lot, and you have kind of hyperactive pattern recognition, which is very similar to someone who is experiencing, who is on a psychedelic drug, which is also very similar to somebody who is highly creative. And I think that it's kind of maybe it's not so studied, but it's certainly like a cultural truism that artists and highly creative people tend to like ride that line of creativity and mental illness, and that they're highly related.
So we didn't really get to the question, why do you guys think there's being a shamanistic revival right now?
I think there's a shamanistic revival right now because people are not experiencing meaningful mystical states that they connect with in other areas. And so we're seeking out different traditions.
Okay. What is a mystical state?
I would say that a mystical state is not the same, but really related to the flow state, where you have kind of a sense of oneness with everything, or maybe a really deep sense of self, and you may experience things like timelessness. And well, there's different types of mystical states, and again, this is something that's difficult to nail down, but I would say it's a state where you have kind of an overwhelming sense of connectedness or intuitive knowledge or feelings that you wouldn't have in your day-to-day. It kind of knocks you out of your day-to-day patterns.
Yeah, so Vervaeke talks about a couple of different types of mystical experience. He talks about the mystical experience that you can have by going further and further and further in, and you can have the type of mystical experience that comes from going further and further and further out. And then he talks about this third type of mystical experience that can happen when you do both at the same time. You're going like in and out at the same time. And I think I did have an experience like that one time on a lot of psychedelic mushrooms.
Like, how do these, you're kind of describing mystical experiences and how they can help us become more aware, how they can get us to feel a certain way. How does that connect to meaning? Like, is the experience itself what we're attaching meaning to, or are we saying that through mystical experiences we can perceive meaning more clearly? Like, how does it connect to meaning?
I think it's, you get a feeling of meaning. You get this like, oh, that was so meaningful. And then, I don't know whether there's really something objective happening there, but there's something very definite in your mind where you have this feeling of this like overwhelming sense of meaning.
I think it's both. Like in the moment, you will experience this profound meaning, but it's also when you have these experiences, it's kind of like a revelation. So it tells you, in a way of speaking, this is a lens for you to see the world. This is a way for you to discover meaning in your everyday experiences.
I would agree with what Kurt said. On the one hand, I think that the mystical experience in and of itself, or these peak experiences, are kind of inherently meaningful. Maybe that's the best way to define it, is it like activates all the whatever meaning feelings are within you, if that's a thing. But then when you do that, it makes you realize and recognize more readily meaning in your everyday life. And also, I think when you have that experience, when you felt that feeling of meaning, it drives you to seek it and to try to create some kind of meaning in your life outside of those experiences as well.
There's kind of like three answers there. There's the and what you're saying, Kate, what you guys all were saying. There's the experience is meaningful in itself. The experience helps us to find meaning in our everyday lives, or the experience helps us to create meaning. And it seems like the former two, like the idea of finding meaning and the idea of creating meaning, are pretty different and maybe even mutually exclusive. And I'm interested what you guys think of that dichotomy.
I think there are feedback loops. So when you get better at creating meaning, you also get better at finding meaning, and vice versa.
Can you give an example as to how those are mutually exclusive? I'm not picturing that.
Well, it seems like is meaning something out there to find, or is it something that we create? Like,
it's something that you interpret.
I think it's both. I think it's a conversation. Sometimes you find meaning inside, and sometimes you find meaning by going outside. And I think that's why both the inward and the outward are necessary in order to have a complete sense of meaning.
Here, I'll give an example maybe. So one thing Vervaeke talks about how like the ancient Israelites reconceptualized time to make it so that it's understood more like a story. So if I understand my life that way, in this kind of ancient biblical sense of like, I'm part of this grand story and my life is a story. Like, let's say I'm actually a character in a novel and someone out there is writing the story, and it's like, and then Ariel recorded the podcast for the day. Like, if there actually is a story that I'm a part of, let's say that's literally true, then there is a meaning to everything that's happening that I can discover. And if I figure out what the story is, I'm like, oh, now I know what I need to do next. Or now I know what I need to work towards, because that's what this story is about. Versus if
Right.
Everything is just completely random, I'd be like, okay, nothing really matters. There's no real meaning. So, but I can, kind of play like there is, and I'll feel better if I do. So for me, that's kind of the difference between discovering and creating meaning.
I disagree. Because I think that in your example, if you found out that you were a character in a book, or like if I found out that I was a character in a book, maybe I would interpret that as being meaningful, because it would be like, wow, I'm part of this grand story, and now I know what I need to do. Or maybe that could drive me to total nihilism based on how I interpreted it. I would say, wow, like there's someone else in control of my life and everything is already predetermined and I'm just supposed to go down this way. Can I even change it? And who's writing this story and what's the purpose of that? So we're all just like, we're in this book and there's no freedom here. That's why I would say that meaning is something that you have to interpret. And like, I think there's certain experiences and certain narratives that are more naturally conducive to meaning. But I think that also someone who's very well practiced in creating and finding meaning, this feedback loop, can interpret extreme meaning out of the tiniest thing. If you just observe a fly, that could be the most meaningless thing in the world to most people, just watching a fly buzzing about. But if you construct a narrative and interpret it in a certain way, it could also be the most meaningful thing.
But I mean, even if you're like constructing a narrative, it's not like you, Katie, came up with constructing narratives in that moment. Like constructing narratives is a cross-cultural thing that seems to extend beyond your like the meaning in that fly. You're only able to come up with a meaning for that fly and to create meaning in that situation because you're drawing from this meaning that already exists, whether it's cultural, cross-cultural, species-wide, or somehow greater.
Yeah, so aren't you actually demonstrating, in saying that, you're demonstrating that these ideas of creating and finding meaning aren't mutually exclusive?
Yeah, that's true.
So Vervaeke addresses this exact problem. He talks about how, in stories like the Plato's Cave, in stories like The Matrix, once you've taken the red pill and you've discovered that you're actually just this character in a story, and you're really just basically living in a simulation of the actual world. You're living in the everyday world rather than the real world, right? Once you've had that taste of the real world, then that's when you have a mystical experience, because because we have this drive that Vervaeke talks about to become closer to actual reality. So once we've experienced, the red pill, we can't take the blue pill. Like almost nobody is going to be like, yeah, sure, I'll take the blue pill and just go back to living in the constructed simulation that I've always lived in, because that would feel very inauthentic to us. We have this drive to get closer to actual reality, and that's not something that we can decide. That's just we have to really believe that the world that we're connected to is actually real and actually out there. And if we feel like it's fake in some way, like it's being manipulated or there's conspiracies and stuff, then our life is going to feel increasingly meaningless, and we're going to feel increasingly depressed and anxious.
Yeah, it's interesting because Vervaeke talks about that model that you just explained, Chris. He talks about how he seems to think that it's a culturally specific model. As he talks about the axial age revolution, which is this idea that between 300 and 800 BCE, various civilizations around the world, in Greece, ancient Israel, and India, they went through this revolution in thought where they developed all these new ways of seeing the world, which we kind of now take for granted because we're still living in the legacy of that shift. And one of them is this idea that there's the everyday world that's humdrum and it's in some way artificial, and then there's this real world that exists above and beyond the regular world. And that part of the goal of a spiritual journey is to get from that ordinary world to the spiritual world. So you see that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, like the idea of like the kingdom of God. You see it with Plato, the idea of these forms. You see it even in Buddhism with the idea of like enlightenment. So it's interesting, that model that you said. Like what do you guys think of that model? He calls it the two worlds model.
It related to something I thought about long ago about Maslow's peak experiences, and how it's like originally Maslow thought that peak experiences were just something that self-actualized people had and something that regular people didn't have, and that was it. And later he learned that everybody has peak experiences, and it's just that self-actualized people have learned to develop it like a sort of skill. And I thought about it, and I imagined like somebody who sort of relates to what Chris is saying. It's somebody who was like very habitual in their regular lives and didn't look into things too deeply. Or maybe say he's even an alcoholic, and one day he has this moment of clarity and he sees this vision of a person that he could be. And then that's how he starts to create his life. So that's like what Vervaeke is talking about when you go out of the cave and look at the sunlight, and then you say, oh, well, how can I make the regular world look more like that?
I think the two worlds kind of model is interesting, because on the one hand, I think a lot of what Vervaeke talks about is that this development of the two worlds mode of thinking is what kind of gave people the motivation for morality, and what gave people a lot of the motivation for self-actualization that we see now, because the narrative is no longer that you're part of this never ending cycle and just in the flow of nature and that you can't do anything about it. But on the other hand, I think that now, and Vervaeke mentions this also, where science is kind of bringing us back from the two worlds dichotomy into more of a one world continuous cosmos. And I think that a lot of the meaning crisis is about how do we construct meaning? How do we create a meaningful narrative out of a continuous cosmos where we no longer have this separation between the everyday and the ideal? How do we fuse the everyday with the ideal?
Right.
Do you want to expand on that a little bit, Katie? Like, I'm curious, like, how do you think that science is bringing up towards this idea of a continuous cosmos more? What is being collapsed?
Okay, so there's a lot of different examples that we could think of. One of the biggest ones is probably evolution. And I think that a lot of people who come from religious backgrounds really struggle with the idea of evolution because it makes you question whether humans are fundamentally different from animals. And I think the more that we learn, the more that we realize that these things are on a continuum. It's not that humans were created in the image of God and animals are animals and we're fundamentally different. It's that humans are a form of animal that evolved much greater mental capacities, but we can see a lot of similarities between ourselves and our primate ancestors. And the reality is that we're all part of a continuous family. So that's one example. Another example, I think, is...
Another one is a mind-body problem.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Do you want to talk about the mind-body problem?
Okay. Yeah, so it's a bit difficult. It's a tricky one. But I guess the modern conception in science or in physics is like there's no difference between the mind and the brain, or like the mind is merely a symptom of the processes of the brain. Whereas in past times, people have thought that, well, it's like the mind and the physical reality are on different planes. And now we see it coming together and sort of denying the mind, or just saying it's part of everything else.
Yeah. So, okay, these two examples I think are pretty good. And there's other ones also we could think about, like the creation story versus like learning about astrophysics and maybe how the earth came to be. But I think that the issue is that the more that we discover about our universe, the more that science is kind of negating the narratives that gave people meaning in the past. Like the separation between the physical and the spiritual and that story, and trying to join the spiritual gave people a lot of meaning and is like a big part of Christianity, that we're like created in God's image and all this. But now it's almost like, okay, if you accept the idea that the mind and the body are the same thing, you kind of get rid of the idea of souls in some way. Or if you accept the idea that humans are part of the animal kingdom like every other animal, and you get rid of the idea of this like divine spark, then it becomes meaningless until you're able to integrate a new narrative that makes sense of that still in a meaningful way. And I think that like floating around in meaningless is what we're in right now.
I don't know. I think it's more complicated than that, though. I think that story that as we've, for one, like there's a few things I think to break down in what you're saying, Katie. But I mean, for one thing, I think that story that as we've advanced more and more in science, the religious stories have become more and more discredited. Like I would seriously question that narrative. I think there have been some advances in science, like heliocentrism and the theory of evolution, that have definitely taken down some sacred cows in certain religions and been pretty distressing for religious people. But I mean, you can look at some other examples. I mean, for one thing, I think the mind-body problem is very unresolved. That's why it's still largely in the domain of philosophy and not in the domain of science, even though scientists take certain baseline philosophical assumptions when studying it. But I think, if you talked about the beginning of the universe, I think that's a great example of a counterpoint. Like before, in the 19th century, scientists under the Newtonian model, they tended to think that the universe had always existed and that it would always exist similar to how it currently does. Like it was like a giant clock. Like like with a pendulum swinging back and forth and hands moving around. And it just would always exist. It had always existed. It would always exist. Newtonian's laws are very like, you have inertia, things remain at rest, things remain in motion. So therefore the universe is in motion. It's always been in motion. And that was considered the sciencey thing to believe. And to believe the universe had a beginning was considered to be a theological, religious, dogmatic, passé way of thinking. In the 20th century, you have Georges Lemaitre, who was a Roman Catholic priest and a scientist, who suggested that the universe had a beginning, that everything began in a tiny point and then it moved outwards. And the components of the universe were created one by one. He was widely ridiculed for this theory because it was considered to be, he was just exporting his Roman Catholicism into science. And the term Big Bang Theory was actually mocking at the beginning. But eventually, when they discovered, the Hubble telescope, and they saw that objects in space exhibited a redshift and all this other evidence came up, the Big Bang Theory, there's a ton of evidence for it now. It's considered to be, it's the mainstream theory that's considered to be correct now. And people forget that it began as this theory that was viewed as being overly religious. So I think it's complicated. I think when you look at the history of science, like there's places where it seems to confirm like a purely materialist, non-spiritualist view of the universe. And there's places where it's hard to reconcile those two viewpoints. And the reality is we just don't know enough right now to say that science has validated one philosophy or another.
So I would agree with you that science doesn't completely disprove God. I wouldn't say that, but I do think that science has definitely undermined a lot of literalistic interpretations of religions that were really important to people in the past. And maybe regardless of what science teaches us, I think that the worldview of scientists and the worldview of, I don't know, the scientific movement, if you want to call that, is to demystify things. So that even if we were to discover like a separate energy field or something like that was actually responsible for consciousness, I think that when you broke it down and looked at it in a scientific way, it would culturally demystify it, maybe, or maybe we're kind of going through a cultural shift where scientific discoveries aren't necessarily demystifying things, but there seems to be some kind of a function of like the more that we understand, the less meaningful it gets to people.
So can I just go back and just break down what continuous cosmos and this what was it called, dual world thing are, where so basically before the axial age, Vervaeke talks about how the dominant worldview was that everything was the same in kind. Nothing was really different from anything else except in degree of power. And so, the humans, had their certain place in the world, and they were basically just powerful animals, right? And the animals were basically just, weak humans. And the gods were basically just powerful humans. And, a really powerful human could be a demigod or could be an actual god. And he talks about how pharaohs were considered to be gods or god kings or something like that. And how this is kind of counterintuitive to us now, because we see gods and humans as being different in kind. And I think what you're seeing in recent times is you're seeing people kind of feel like gods now. They feel like there isn't really a God. They feel like, I have a smartphone, it can do anything. I can have food and water whenever I want. And there really isn't anything to aspire to be that's greater than what we already are. And so I think that in order for us to continue progressing as a species, we need that vision of the future of how, like a specific vision of how we can be better, how we can grow to get there.
Chris, we're behaving both like gods and like animals. Like we can do whatever we want to, we can have whatever we want to, and we choose to have like sex and porn and lots of yummy food. And
right. Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Like capricious
I disagree.
gods like Zeus or something.
Yeah, pre-axial gods.
I disagree that the continuous cosmos view of the world has to necessarily lead to like a total lack of self-improvement or meaning, like maybe it was interpreted in the past. I think that you can recognize that you are of the same kind as the other materials in the universe and the other animals that exist, but then study the process of evolution and study the process of self-actualization and still aim to become the highest peak of your potential without necessarily like without invoking some separate spiritual perfect world to aim towards.
Well, I mean, putting aside the question of a separate spiritual world for the moment, like that, like whether it's material or not, there, from what I can see, there clearly is a hierarchy. Like there's a rock, and I'm made of the same material as the rock at a certain level. And there's, I don't know, a lizard who's more complex than the rock and is more similar to me, and we're even more similar, me and the lizard. And then there's a mammal, and we're even more similar. And then there's another human being, and there's a hierarchy. Like I value the lizard more than the rock. I value the mammal more than the lizard, and I value another human being more than a non-human mammal.
Totally. Well, continuous doesn't mean sameness. It just means that there's not a fundamental break or a fundamental.
Right, but the only difference
there are
in
fundamental
the cosmos is degrees of power. And so in the continuous cosmos, what people would say is, well, a human is more valuable than a lizard because a human has more power than a lizard.
Okay, that was the break that Vervaeke says in the past, but I don't think that that's what he says or what I would say that we're returning to philosophically.
I think that's exactly what postmodernism is. It's everything is the same kind. The only difference is power.
That's
interesting.
Yeah, I mean that's
postmodernism is literally the exact same thing as continuous cosmos.
But I think you can have other continuous visions that aren't about power.
But
okay,
so okay, what would be a continuous vision that's not about power?
I mean, you could come up with a lot, like complexity, intelligence, benefit to the other beings within your cosmos, like any metric that you want to, you could build a philosophy around.
But I mean, it seems like there's clearly a discrete element in that. Like even if I'm saying like, you know, like there's clearly at least a break between the rock and the lizard. Because the lizard is a living thing; it's got DNA and cells and all this machinery, and the rock does not.
Well, okay. What do you mean by a discrete? What do you mean by a discrete?
There's a categorical difference between living things and non-living things, like the rock and the lizard and the mammal and the rest of us.
Sure. So we make categories in our mind to be able to make better sense of things. Like there's a categorical difference between a baby and an adult, but that doesn't mean that they're made of fundamentally different material or fundamentally spiritually different in some way.
But they are made of fundamentally different material.
I think
they're spiritually different. They're spiritually different.
Fundamental. I mean, this is a
they're
matter.
all made of quarks, right? That's the
And also a baby continuously evolves into an adult.
Yeah, but just because there's a continuous and a discrete element. Like there's a level in which we're all made of atoms, and so we're on a continuum with the rock. But there's also a level, if you're looking at it at a different level of abstraction, there's discrete categories.
Yeah, so I think the question is, is there some fundamental difference between us and animals that makes us better than animals? And if so, that means there's probably somewhere for us to go from here, right? Because we were animals and we became humans, right? And so that means that there's somewhere else for us to go. That means that there's some other axis besides power that should be used for which things are better than other things, right?
Why would power be?
If there is such a thing, that means that we should continue along that axis, right? But if there isn't such a thing, then what's the point of becoming better than we are now, since we are not better than animals?
Well, here's one way to think about it. And I've got a lot of thoughts about this, and it's a bit difficult for me to put it all together. But I think I remember my friend practicing seva in an ashram, and he, in a sense, he's a supervisor in the kitchen. And somebody asked him, one of the other Sevites asked him, "So you're the boss here, right?" And he was like, the other Sevites were like, "Yeah, he's the boss." But he was like, I don't want to answer. I don't want to say that I'm the boss. And I remember we had a conversation about it with my monk friend, and my friend said, well, look, it's one way to look at it is he has his role and I have my role, and they're just different roles. So this is also like a spiritual perspective. Like when you look at a rock, you might think, well, this is somehow inferior to me. I mean, that's kind of what the hierarchy concept from Ariel implies. I'm not sure if you mean it that way.
Yes, I think a rock is inferior to me.
Okay, well, I don't think that way. I mean, in a practical sense, I might. Yeah, are you a rockist? In a practical sense,
anti-rockist.
Kind of, yes. It's kind of true. Like
conservatives have always hated rock music, you know.
It all makes sense now.
I knew they were all racists.
Yeah.
Rockists.
But in a sense, I don't think about it like that. I think a rock has its place and I have my place. And as a human, I have certain things that I can do that a rock can't, and it makes sense for me to do them well. So that kind of, I think that answers Chris's question, like why aspire, why create, why be better than we are? Because that's what we are. And just like we expect a tree to grow and we expect a rock to sit and we expect crystals to vibrate and the water to flow.
But what I'm saying is if we didn't improve ourselves at all by going from being animals to being humans, then what's the point on continuing on this path? Like, we might as well just go back to being animals because they're just as good as us.
Yeah.
That's a weird perspective to me. Like, animals also improved themselves continuously to become what they are. We specialized in very, very different ways, and humans specialized in a way which gave us a lot more adaptive potential and potential for flourishing mentally in like many, many, many different directions. Whereas like the ways that animals specialized are generally more specialized. But
so you're saying being specialized is a good axis of measuring, of evaluating.
Well, I would say you need to look at a lot of different axes, and better and more power is a weird axis for me to want to frame it around. That's just not where my head goes.
Yeah, you kind of have to give up better or good if you're gonna just give up hierarchy, because you need a hierarchy of values at least to be able to say what better is, because otherwise.
Yeah, what I'm saying is if we are not better than animals, then what's the point of continuing trying to improve if we're not improving? Like, I think this is part of the meaning crisis. Like, what are we doing?
I don't understand the question.
And here's one way to frame it. Human civilization is extremely harmful for many other living creatures on this planet. So one way to look at it, like if you read the book Oryx and Crake, the guy is basically like, we should just get rid of humans, and then all other life forms would do a lot better. It would be a lot better for them. And it seems like if you're not willing to say human beings are more valuable than other creatures, you kind of have to be a primitivist in that way. You kind of have to be like, we got to get rid of humans, or at least civilization.
Yeah, exactly. If you think that humans are no better than animals, then why not just get rid of civilization and go back to living, in the trees?
Well, why would I do that? I mean, I'm a human, so I'm going to do what humans do. I'm not going to.
Humans used to live in trees.
But that's a weak argument, though. Like what if I say, like, I don't know, I'm a Canadian. Why should I care about non-Canadians? Or I'm this ethnicity. Why should I care about other ethnicities? Like if
you're saying rocks are less valuable than humans, and I'm not saying that.
But you're saying we should just prioritize humans, but because basically we're being chauvinistic because we're humans, and that seems arbitrary. Like, why not be chauvinistic about race or sex or some other thing then, if I'm just going to be chauvinistic?
I don't think that Curtis said that we should prioritize humans either.
He said I should care more about humans because I am a human.
No,
he said that.
I don't think I said that at all.
Okay, do you want to clarify what you were saying?
Why would I go to behaving like another animal? Because
are we talking about Kurt or me?
Kurt. I'm talking about Kurt.
Okay, Kurt, do you want to maybe clarify your argument?
I'm saying as a human, I have a certain role and I have a potential, and it's an opportunity for me as a human to fulfill that potential. And so that's what I will do.
Okay. Well, would you prioritize the life of a human above the life of another animal? Like if it was a burning building, let's say, and you ran to the burning building and there was a dog and a human child and you can only save one, let's say.
Yes, I would.
You'd save the human.
Yes.
Why?
But you're putting me into this framework, and it's a hypothetical which doesn't have a lot to do with what I'm talking about. Why would I? Because I relate more to humans than other animals. I would save my humans before my house plants. I would.
Okay, so you think there's something more inherently valuable about human life than animal life, correct?
No. I'm saying there's something that I want to care for more. So it's not like something objective. It's just I'm playing my role.
Right. Value is subjective, right?
Well, that's what you guys are arguing.
Well, that's what capitalists tend to argue.
I mean, well, I agree with you that value is subjective. But I asked you what you value. I'm asking you about your subjective value. I said, do you think that humans are more inherently valued than animals? And you said, no.
You said inherent. You said value is subjective, and then you asked if they're more inherently valuable, which is kind of a contradiction.
Inherent value is subjective. All right, that's confusing, I guess.
Okay, Kurt, what do you think the role of humanity is?
It's hard for me to say that, but I think a lot of it is finding out what our potential is and expressing it. So in terms of art and music and creativity, building things and protecting things, that's like all of the potential of the human brain. If we can try to even conceptualize how far that goes, we should pursue that. Or that's
but why?
The role.
What if we're just destroying everything by doing that? How do we know we're doing something good? What's the metric for good?
We don't know. We have to discover that as we go. So we have to discover, as humans, being aware of our own potential, being aware that we can create things, and being aware that we can even increase our potential. We have the opportunity to pursue that and to protect things that we like, and like the environment and other things. So I know it sounds kind of circular, maybe it is, but this is like, if I ask you, what is a rock's responsibility, or what is a rock's role in the world? You say it is a very difficult question to answer.
How do we discover what our purpose is, or what is good, Kurt? Because you seem to want this concept of good and purpose, but where does it come from?
I don't think I said about a concept of good. Well, maybe I did.
You said better. You said better a few times. Okay,
fair enough. How do we discover our own purpose?
Yeah. Like you're talking. You're giving kind of these aspects of what purpose might be, like protecting the environment and creating art. But how do we know? Like what if I'm kind of hearing those things and I'm wondering in my head, like, that kind of just sounds like what my society happens to value. Am I just like absorbing the values of my society? Like if I was born in a different society, would I'd say, if I was a Mongol, would I say like conquering small villages is what's good and what's important, and being close to your horse is what's good and what's important? So how do I figure it out? Like how do I carry out the search for what's good and what's purposeful?
It is a conversation between an individual and a society. So an individual can't be separated from a society. So in part, you find out your purpose by knowing your place in the society. So it's through self-exploration and through conversation, and there's probably some techniques about it, about writing and finding out what you're good at when you were young, and there's a whole bunch of things, discovering your own nature, which I'm not especially skilled in, but there are self-help books around that. So it's a very broad question.
So I guess I would frame it this way. I think a lot of people would disagree with you that humanity is becoming something good. I think a lot of people would say we're destroying the environment. We're causing all this suffering. And so if we continue along the same path and just keep going and keep doing things that we've always done, then how do we know we aren't just going to destroy everything? Like how do we know that just, as you said, like just doing whatever is in our nature is actually good?
I didn't say it's just doing whatever's in your nature, because I said it's a process of self-discovery. Well, I guess, or the other way to look at it is going against the way that society is going is also part of our nature. So that's a part of the conversation as well. Sorry, Katie.
I was just going to ask if I could chime in, because, well, I don't think that you said that what humans were doing was good, right?
Yeah, it's just about fulfilling our role, just like a rock.
Okay, so why try to fulfill our role? What is our role?
Because we have the potential. We have the potential to pursue these opportunities. We have most of us have the ability. So,
but what's the point?
There's no point. You don't have to do it. You can opt out if you want to. It's just we have a great opportunity, and I think pursuing opportunities.
But why do anything at all if there's no point? Why can't I just say nothing? Why does the whole society just grind to a halt?
You can, but why would you do that?
But I guess I just this idea that we should just follow our nature. Like when I look at like my nature, maybe I'm good at a few things. Like maybe I'm good at going to bars, getting drunk and beating people up. Maybe I'm good at constructing nuclear power plants, and maybe I'm good at playing the violin. And I'm like, ooh, I have all these aspects of my nature. Like which one should I foster? Like is it just
a process of self-discovery and conversation with society?
But that's still looking.
Yes. That's right.
Okay. Well, let's give another example. Let's say now it's 1937 and I'm a German in Nazi Germany, and I'm like, I'm really good at being a soldier, and that's my skill. And my society is like, you know what, we need a lot of soldiers right now. And I'm like, hey, like, my society, me, this is like a great fit. I'm just going to go become a Nazi soldier.
Okay.
There's nothing wrong with that in your view?
It's not about wrong or right. It's like, say, if I tell you the example of a lion in the jungle. Now, the lion is or on the plains rather, is going to go up and chase down a family of gazelles, and it's going to eat one of them. Now, is that right or wrong, or is the lion just playing its part?
I think only human beings are capable of right and wrong. I believe we have a choice. I mean, it seems like your worldview almost implies determinism, like everything just happens as it inevitably will.
No, that's not what I'm talking about.
Wait, so if you're saying like I'm just a psychopath that likes to kill people because, the lion likes to kill gazelles and eat them, I should be able to just go and kill people and eat them.
No, I don't think I'm saying that, but it's a part of the process as well. So there's this parable about the guru saying to one of his students, listen, God is within everything. And the student goes down the street the next day and it's just kind of happy. He's had a good time with the guru and he's done his morning meditation. And there's an elephant coming down the street, and everybody stops and says to the student, hey, listen, there's an elephant coming down the street. You got a problem if you keep going this direction. And he's like, well, God is in everything, so it's no big deal. And then, he keeps going, and he gets very injured as a result. So, then later he speaks to the guru and said, why did you tell me that God is in everything? And of course the guru says, well, didn't people try to warn you about walking down the street where the elephant was? So it's not, it's not like, okay, the psychopath is there in isolation. There's a whole system that's going on here. So there's a system that's trying to prevent the psychopath. There's a system of, say, Buddhas and gurus emerging, people pursuing self-knowledge that try to teach and try to help people achieve their moral potential. And there's a whole system going on. So it's not just one thing, but it's all a process, and we're all playing our part. And it doesn't necessarily mean you should become a psychopath, but we are playing our part, and I don't think we can avoid that.
Well, okay, if you believe that there's free choice, then there's different paths that things could go down. There's not just a single path. And if you get back to the example of Nazi Germany, you're really emphasizing this idea of having an individual honing their skills and fitting that with society. The problem, the way that I problematize that is I brought up the idea of someone who was really good at being a soldier during Nazi Germany, say early World War II. That person has a choice between either becoming a Nazi or, let's say, joining the German resistance. Either way, they're honing their skills at being a soldier and their natural capacities. I would say there's a very big difference between that choice. Would you?
Yes. Well, but I'm not talking about, I'm not giving you a decision-making guideline. That's not the scope of what I'm saying. I'm just saying that everything has its role to play, and that doesn't mean anything is superior or inferior to anything else. It's just
if you're not saying, if you're refusing to like put any kind of value judgment though on anything, then how do you say that soldier becoming a resistance fighter against the Nazis is better than them becoming a Nazi? Like if they're facing,
I wouldn't say it's better or worse. It's just what it is.
Okay, so then how it seems that you're basically saying that.
Right. So why do anything as opposed to anything else?
Well, why?
No value system. If there's no way to value actions.
That's the question. That's the great mystery. Why do anything?
Okay, so your answer is I don't know.
Well, I would posit a value hierarchy that guides my actions. Like I would say it's better not to be a Nazi.
Okay. I mean,
would you just say it's just like a different quality of experience, but there's no actual value judgment between the two options?
More or less. I mean, obviously you put me in a very difficult position. It makes me sound like I have no opinions about whether people should be Nazis or not.
Well, I think it's a problem with I think it's a legitimate problem with your belief system. I think you put yourself in this position.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I don't really think it's a problem. I mean, I think it's a process of history. I think every individual does what he or she does and tries to determine the best thing to follow their path. And some people are going to, we can call them mistakes, but they're a part of history. They're a part of our own stories. We all make we all do things that we're not proud of. And this is part of the greater process.
But if we're not proud of them, why not be equally proud of it if we're not positing a value hierarchy? Like if I was a Nazi and I'm looking back and I'm like, oh, it's all just equivalent anyway. I'll just go be a Nazi again next time. Why not? Like if we're not actually saying one is better or worse, why be proud or not proud of anything that happens?
Yeah.
There's no reason really.
No particular reason. It's just a part of a process.
Okay. I mean, I don't think, but you're saying that we have free choice. So we do have the ability to make choices, but you're basically denying that there's any metric by which to value one choice as being better than a different choice.
I mean, I think it's important to add that I think both of you would agree with this, that the reason why Nazis are such a great example is because they're so universally agreed to have done something bad and evil. And I think that's actually useful knowledge to us. The doctrine of racial superiority has basically just been completely debunked at this point. But I think it maybe took a world war in order to discover that. So I think maybe Kurt would say, yeah, there were bad people doing bad things, but they didn't necessarily know that they were doing bad things. They thought they were doing good things. But now we know that that's bad.
Yes, that's a part of the process.
I think there are a lot of different metrics by which you could evaluate. So like when we say what is good and what is bad, people are using a mixture of different metrics at different times. And that's why it's really hard to pin down like what exactly is good and what is bad. But things like Nazism can be categorized under bad by the vast majority of metrics that people use for good and bad. So like personally, yeah, like generally speaking, I would say being a Nazi is horrible and that was really bad and Hitler was really, really bad. If you're like pinning me down to ask what does bad mean in like a really precise philosophical way, then it would be much more difficult for me to say that that's bad. I would say it's not in alignment with all of humanity and the earth reaching its full potential. It's not in alignment with minimizing suffering. It's not in alignment with empathy. It's not in alignment with all of these metrics that I use at different times for good and bad, but the truth is that I don't, nor do I think that anyone really does have a definitive metric for good and bad.
Yeah, and I think that sort of things, you know, that's kind of what Vervaeke was talking about a bit. He was saying that we don't always have clear definitions for some of these complex topics, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist.
Well,
I believe that the definitions don't exist, and I think that pursuing a clear static definition of good and bad is a mistake.
Well, okay. I think the fact that Nazism is universally reviled in the modern, or nearly universally reviled in our modern day and age, tells us a lot about good and evil. Like, it tells us a lot about what actual good and evil is. Like it's Nazism was a good example in that case because it was an example of a society being evil as well as an individual, which was good, useful for Kurt's example. But if we're just talking about examples of things that are evil, I can think of, you know, serial killers, child rapists, pick your someone shooting up a school, someone
slavery,
Jim Jones,
human
slavery,
sex trafficking.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's lots of things I can think of that are evil.
Destroying the environment,
killing all the dolphins. Like there's lots of things that are evil that I can think of, but it's that's the thing. It's hard to think of good. Like Jordan Peterson points this out. It's hard to think of it's hard to clearly define good. It's hard to even conceptualize good, but evil is very clear. Like we know what evil is, and that kind of allows us to orient ourselves because we can at least say, like, what is evil? It's really hard to know, but we can think of a lot of examples of evil. We can think of a lot of things that really grab us as evil and that other people also have this reaction to. And that allows us to kind of be like, okay, let's try to point ourselves away from that and see if that can be a basis for building some kind of structural, functional understanding of good and evil.
The important thing is that, and I think this is one of the major problems with our society, is that we can't focus on just the bad stuff and just trying to avoid the bad stuff. We have to aspire to something greater. Okay, we have to try. We can't just avoid pain. We have to aspire to feel more pleasure and happiness and joy and fulfillment. And in order to dust ourselves off and try again, we have to have that vision of the future that we're trying to get to. And I think that's the important thing in this conversation is that, like Kurt, you said, you have to try and fulfill your purpose. Well, you have to have a picture of what your purpose is, so that you can aspire to do that. If you think that your purpose is just to sit there and wallow in despair, and starve to death or something because you don't feel like getting up and going to get food, then yeah, you're going to have a miserable existence. But if you aspire to something, if you say, I'm going to, life will be better if I do this because I have this vision of how things are going to be better, and then you go and try that, then I think that's a moral good.
I think that you can discover your own purpose and have a sense of good and self-improvement without there being a static, perfect ideal. And I think that dualistic philosophies tend to say that you need this like ideal, something like God or heaven or holiness that you're aspiring to in order to have any metrics for improvement or motivations for improvement at all. And I don't think that you need that.
I think that you do need that. And the reason why I think that you need that is because in order for society to be successful, everybody has to share. In order for any group of people to be successful, they have to share a common vision. And I think having, maybe you don't have to have God, but you have to have some kind of standards, some kind of moral standards, so that people know which things are good and which things are bad, and everybody can kind of work in the same direction. And I think that's what gives living in a society meaning. You can't just have individuals all with their own visions, because then the society isn't working towards anything mutually meaningful. It's just, a bunch of people, it might as well just be a bunch of bacteria, living, in a giant pile of, excrement or something. There's no difference between an organized human society and that, without this shared sense of good and bad, basically.
I'm not sure though. I think I want to make a distinction here, because I'm not sure, like, it's interesting because like the older worldviews, the older axial worldviews did have kind of this, that tended to have this idea of like an ideal, like an ideal of good, like God, like something to point towards and work towards, and a shared vision of the kingdom of heaven and this kind of thing. And I'm not totally sure that we can still have that anymore in our society. And I want to kind of distinguish that from that and the idea, because there's the idea that there's no way to make any kind of value judgment about anything ever. And then I think there's a lot of space between that. Like I can think of something like one way I can think of doing things is like, or that appeals to me is like this idea of like, there's something we're moving towards. We don't know what it is. It's a question mark. We don't know what it is, but there's these, like, I think there's a lot in between those extremes. Like, I think it's possible to have moral systems where you can identify instances of good and instances of evil and come up with systems of moral behavior that seem to, I don't know, maybe now I'm thinking maybe you do need to have some kind of image of ultimate good, like the form of good and the form of evil, even if they're more abstract and they're not actually like embodied in a literal person, like was the case in past times. Like I'm kind of questioning that now. Like I can also see moral systems where instead of it being like oriented towards an ideal, it was oriented towards like systems of behavior or systems of virtue or like a process instead of an ideal. But now I'm kind of wondering if maybe even a process would need to be oriented towards an ideal. So I got a little bit lost, but anyway.
So I think Vervaeke is making the argument that the ideal, this other axis of goodness that we're looking for is wisdom. Okay? If we can get closer and closer in our connectedness to reality and we can become wiser, then that's moral good. And that's something that we should strive for.
I feel like that you get into the same issue as Kurt though, because why be wise? Like, is wisdom just the goal in and of itself? Or is there something, does wisdom help us achieve something? Is there something that wisdom is helping us do?
I think this issue exists no matter whatever way you shake it. Even if you have your ideal of good and evil, why are you aiming towards good? Why not go towards evil? Because good is good? Like, I think that this is the fundamental...
No, because wisdom is better than ignorance.
Sure.
Why is it better?
Why?
Better?
Because it leads to less suffering.
Okay, so that's your metric.
It connects us to reality. It connects us to reality closer.
These are metrics that I generally agree with you on, but you're positing them as if they're like definitely.
Okay, morality is what tells you which things are problems and what ways to solve them, which solutions are acceptable. You have to have a moral framework in order for that to even make sense.
It doesn't have to be.
That's a funny way of looking at it, Chris, because it's like if the TV isn't working and you attempt to fix it, I don't think many people would see that.
You say this is a bad situation, and fixing the TV would be a good situation. Like,
I don't think
maybe that's not some overarching, like objective, thing, but that's for you right now. The TV being broken is bad, and it being fixed would be good. And so
you could also just say that you would prefer it.
For all of society, this is a problem. And so this is how we fix it as a society, okay? He's not saying, he's maybe not saying this is some, like absolute eternal truth, but he's saying, right now in Western civilization, this is true for all of us.
Maybe go ahead. Maybe you can try to do a Socratic thing against
that the meaning crisis is bad.
Chris, because let's try something. Yeah, like ask a series of Socratic questions to Kurt or Katie. Maybe that might be a useful exercise. And then
I think it'd be interesting to do it.
Okay, is the meaning crisis a problem which needs to be fixed?
Okay, who are you choosing, Kurt or Katie? Maybe we've already done Kurt. I already kind of did it to Kurt, so maybe try Katie.
I'll go. If you asked me that in a general day-to-day conversation, I would say absolutely yes. In this conversation, the words bad and problem and needs to be fixed are so loaded that I cannot answer you.
In your opinion, don't think about what I'm thinking. Think about what you're thinking.
Yeah, but
you're not understanding.
Clearly. We need to clearly know what the definitions of the words are in order to answer the question accurately.
Okay, can you repeat the question, Chris? What was the question you asked, Katie?
It's amazing.
No. Let's just try to get to the bottom of this. So, did you ask them how do you solve the meaning crisis if you don't believe in morality? Is that the question?
He asked.
No, I said is the meaning crisis a problem?
You asked, is it a problem that needs to be fixed?
well, let's say, is it a problem? That's an even simpler question.
Okay, maybe what do you think the meaning crisis is? Like Katie.
Yeah, Katie, how would you define the meaning crisis, and do you think that it's a problem?
Okay. On this level, okay. How do I define the meaning crisis? I would say that the meaning crisis is a trend, a tendency that a lot of people are going through right now based on some factors in our society where people are lacking a sense of meaning and purpose, and it is making them experience their lives as worse. And so for each of these people, and therefore for society as a whole, but maybe not for the universe in some objective sense, it is a problem in the sense that like it's something that is causing people negative experiences that they would like to overcome. So it's a problem. Like people are working on it, like you would work on a problem. Yeah.
But you don't agree that
I agree. It's a
you're
problem.
not having that problem, and so you.
How do you
No,
think? Okay, Katie. How do you think the problem might be addressed?
I think that
So
there's
it is
a lot
problem.
You said it was a problem for the individuals involved because it was causing them distress, and maybe for
And
the
also
society.
a problem for society.
yeah.
Maybe not a problem for the universe, but it's a problem for society.
You're
For
really
society
trying to
and
nail down everything that I say.
Yes, I'm
And
trying to figure out what you think.
Well, but that's the issue is like with a person with a philosophy like me or like Kurt, if you try to nail down the words into these like meanings, then you're not going to get it, I think.
Yeah, because you've got assumptions hidden within the words and hidden within the questions, and it's very difficult to answer a question when you've got so many loaded assumptions.
Like, you'll forgive me for trying to interpret what you're saying with using my own framework, because that's the only way I know how to communicate. Like, I can't just let you talk and then not interpret it. Otherwise, communication has not occurred.
Well,
I don't know. I mean, I feel like it is
let me
possible.
talk, and what you should try to do, or what I would suggest that you try to do if you try to understand me, is rather than listening to my words and interpreting it through your framework, try to embody my framework.
That's exactly what I'm trying to do.
Maybe. Okay.
So
We
can you
can
help
try.
me with that?
I'm trying.
Okay, Katie. So the meaning problem. How would you say this problem might be addressed?
Well, that's a really big question.
How would you go about addressing it? Let's say.
Okay. Well, like personally, I can give you a story about how in my own life I tried to go about addressing it. When I was going through a difficult period in my life, I decided that I wanted to move to a foreign country where I knew no one and didn't speak the language and have a lot of free time so that and be isolated so that I could induce an existential crisis and chaos so that I could try to rebuild something out of that. And that's what I've done.
Okay, so that's kind of a lot like what Vervaeke was talking about when he talks about attention, where he says basically, in order to solve an insight problem, you have to first break down your existing assumptions before you can creatively build up something new.
Yeah. So you have to break down your existing assumptions. I mean, for me, isolation was part of the method, going through some hard times. And this wasn't all purposeful in the moment. Psychedelia was part of the process. Journaling was part of the process. Interacting with lots of different kinds of people was part of the process.
And so you feel that through this process, you built up a new system of meaning that is basically unique to you and wouldn't transfer to other people.
Yeah.
Okay, Chris, do you want to chime in? Do you have questions?
I'm not really seeing how that relates to, do you think the meaning crisis is a problem, and how should we fix it? So
it relates because Katie was having related problems in her own life, and then she sought to solve it in her personal way.
Okay, so are you saying that you don't have any ideas as to how to fix the meaning crisis, or are you saying that maybe the way that you solved your meaning crisis could apply to this society-wide meaning crisis?
I would say that the way that I went about solving the meaning crisis could probably serve as a helpful story for other people who are trying to solve their own meaning crisis in their own ways. And that like there seem to be common threads in what people are able to find.
So do you think that, so it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you think that the solution to the meaning crisis, this society-wide meaning crisis, is for people to solve their own individual meaning crises, and that they maybe can use stories like yours as inspiration for this.
Well, that's part of it. I mean, I think that society is made up of individuals, and if we're going to get through the meaning crisis, then people need to solve their own meaning crises individually. I don't think that that means that larger figures can't play an important role in inspiring or guiding people on how to find meaning. But I don't think that there's like a step-by-step, do this and you're going to find meaning.
I agree with that.
Where do you see the common threads, Katie? You mentioned common threads.
I think that a lot of people, so we've talked about the hero's journey archetype. I think that a lot of people end up finding meaning through leaving their past beliefs, their past location, sometimes their past, like leaving their past frame and experiencing something radically different. Psychedelia is part of this too. It's basically going through, if you are feeling unsatisfied with the meaning frame that you were raised in and it's no longer meaningful to you, then going out into a period of chaos and taking in a bunch of new input is going to probably cause chaos, but that seems to be a process that many people find helpful because you need a lot of new information and a lot of new input in order to try to construct something on the other side.
So you are kind of saying, getting to this distinction of like in this model is, it seems like there's kind of two things happening. Like you're introducing some chaos in order to burn away some of the old outdated meaning systems that weren't serving you. You're going into a new environment where you're getting more inputs, and you're carrying out an intentional process of meaning, of trying to build meaning for yourself. And so it seems,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I would also say that society is doing this. And when we're talking about the meaning crisis, what we're talking about is society's natural period of chaos.
Okay. So anyway, so you're in this like foreign country, and you're working on building meaning. It seems like part of it is coming from Katie, and part of it is coming from the things you encounter in the external world. Mm-hmm. So it's a combination of creating meaning and discovering meaning around you.
Yeah.
So,
well, and a lot of things that people do, that like both isolation and exploration are tools that people talk about for trying to break your frame and come up with a new frame. And by moving to a different country, I think it's a good strategy for doing both at once. But I don't think that's the strategy for everyone, obviously.
It's interesting. And like to extend the analogy, because you made an analogy between your meaning crisis and the societal meaning crisis, which is probably an apt analogy because it is taking place on the individual and the collective level. It seems like if we're saying humanity in a way has moved to a foreign country where there's a lot of chaos and there's these new languages to learn, and a lot of our old models are being burnt away or can't be used anymore. It seems like you could make an analogy there where like part of, I don't know how you'd extend an analogy, part of this new meaning system that's going to emerge is going to come from within the society itself, and part of it is going to come maybe from within humanity itself, and part of it is going to come externally from the things that humanity encounters. So it's still this feedback loop.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a feedback loop. Okay, so maybe in terms of like answering the question of how I think the meaning crisis can be solved, I don't think that we can posit like a step by step, but I think that there are certain things that you can do that create conditions for more powerful feedback loops.
I just want to ask the question that I was asking before, which is, do you think that should happen? Do you think people should go through that process that you described?
So I don't think it's necessarily a question of should. Sorry.
Oh yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I don't necessarily think it's a question of should. It's just a question of what is going to happen. And yes, it is a process, and it's likely going to occur.
Yeah, we're coming up on the end here, so I'm going to ask one more question to finish us up, which I think is related to what we were talking about before. Let's talk about psychedelics. So it kind of seems like psychedelics relate a lot to what we're talking about. Like they could be a way, they could fit into this in important ways. Like what do you guys think?
I think psychedelics are about that they're one of the most chaotic tools, if not the most chaotic tool known to man right now. So I think that they can definitely fit in. If your goal is to break your frame, then it can do that. But they're also they're a dangerous tool because like they're gonna break your frame, you know? So I don't know if I would like recommend like, yeah, society should do psychedelics and that's going to solve the meaning crisis.
But we need say it would be cool to have a framework where people can support others. Like, so there's already things like MDMA therapy and ayahuasca retreats where people are integrated psychologically afterwards, and that mitigates the risks. So it introduces this chaos in a way. It's a sort of controlled chaos, the right amount of chaos, and with support structures around it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that I think that having support structures for psychedelics would be beneficial for society, based on my judgment. I wasn't sure. I was kind of looking at Chris to see if his ears perked up when I said beneficial or not.
You can't see my ears. Headphones.
Okay, here's something I'm wondering. So I'm hearing like this narrative you're putting out, Katie, and it seems like to a certain extent, like this process of like breaking down and building up, like would involve people in some ways converging on similar belief systems, because everyone, or at least on related belief systems, because we're all operating in this world. So, you know,
Probably.
we're all operating in the same world at a certain level, but it also seems like we could all end up with pretty different belief systems. Like if we all did psychedelics, or if we all moved to foreign countries and learn new language, or isolated ourselves, or went through shamanic experiences, like it seems like if all that's going on is that it's introducing chaos, like it seems like we could just all end up, you know, I don't know, Kurt could be like, I became a deer and now I want to go save the deers. And Katie could be like something different. Like I saw God and now I'm a Christian or something. Or I could be like, I don't know, I'm an atheist now. Like that's kind of, it seems like if it's just chaos, we could all become different things. And I just kind of wonder, because it does seem like, I don't necessarily, I almost wonder if there's something else. Like if these experiences, particularly some of these psychedelics, like people seem to sometimes often say the same things coming out of them. Like, I wonder if there's a content there beyond just introducing the chaos.
So that's an interesting question. Well, psychedelics can introduce chaos in some ways in that they break up your default mode network of your brain, and they like connect different areas that usually aren't connected. So I would say that's chaos. And also it's like a very chaotic experience for most people as they're going through it. Maybe not for all people, but there do seem to be some things that are convergent. But it's interesting because I feel like people who go through psychedelic experiences almost tend to converge on a form of divergent thinking or tend to become more accepting or less judgmental. This is just what I see happening, and I might be wrong, but I think that when we get out of this meaning crisis, it's not going to be like there's a new religion and, like Buddhism is the new religion and everybody's in it like Christianity was before. I think it's going to be some kind of a way where we're able to work with differences and different paths in a new way, but we share the common frame of accepting each other's journeys. So that's kind of a commonality. I like libertarianism in some ways, but this is part of it that appeals to me.
I don't know. I feel like the meta frame has to be more complex than acceptance personally.
It's more complex than acceptance for sure.
So one thing that I've really just been trying to figure out for a long time in this conversation is like, is this descriptive or prescriptive? Like, are we describing how things are and are going to be, or are we describing how things should be?
Well, okay, so I'm describing how things are and how I think they're going to be. And then I'm also describing how maybe I would like them to be and how I think that a lot of people would like them to be. But should has a lot of stuff in it.
Right. Okay. So there is some definition of should, right? There's at the very least, there's your definition of should. And then maybe there's this greater sense in which, maybe there's a lot of people who agree with that assessment.
I'm definitely talking in terms of both. Like, I think when I'm talking about Katie and Kurt's worldview, I'm just trying to, I think with Kurt, I was being a little bit normative, but normative means when you're talking about how things should be, or you're talking in terms of how things should be. But I think when I'm talking about Katie and Kurt's worldview, I'm kind of doing it descriptively, like I'm trying to understand it. And then, like, for me, I'm trying to map out the various possibilities of how things could go. And then, but I'm always in my mind, I have like a weighting on like which ones I think are better and which ones I think are worse.
I was going to say, maybe this would help, because you're asking like, is there a definition of should? And I don't know if Kurt would agree with me on this, but like when we're talking about definitions.
No, I'm not saying, is there a definition of should? I'm saying clearly there is some definition of should, because you're using words like this is beneficial, like clearly you have some idea of what you're talking about.
Okay, but
I just want to know what that is.
Note that when I use a word like beneficial, I usually like pause and I go, beneficial, because it's clear that it's not exactly conveying what's in my head. And I think that this is a commonality between me and Kurt, and also why it's so confusing, is that the ideas that we're expressing are maybe a little bit more fluid and also don't have that, they don't map well onto language. At least I haven't found a way yet to map them well onto language. So
what are you saying? Like, are you just not saying anything? Are you saying something?
I'm not saying anything. Maybe
just another factor. Yeah.
Maybe just the way that we're talking is more evocative. Go ahead.
Okay. So on a personal level, I can't necessarily say what other people should do. So I'm just trying to describe the processes, and I'm not trying to tell people what they should do, but I can present a bunch of options. On another level, I'm also, like I say, these things are all part of a process, and it's all one big process, but I can't deny that I'm part of the process. So I'm part of the marketplace. So I'm doing what I'm doing as well. And so I'm going to be mindful of my own decisions.
Kurt, do you think there's things that you should and shouldn't do?
Yes, I suppose so.
So you get to be a moral actor, but we don't.
No, that's not what I'm saying. People can be moral actors if they want.
Why are you saying there's something that you should and shouldn't do, but you wouldn't say there's something I should and shouldn't do? Like, what? Why is that? Why would that be different?
It's not my place to say.
He's just saying he can't speak for you. He's saying he can speak for himself, but he can't speak for you.
That's right. I can't make decisions for you, and I can't bear the consequences of your decisions.
No, but you still can tell me should though. You still can have an
I
opinion
could,
on
but I hope
evaluation.
I wouldn't, because I don't think I should.
Well, what if I'm like holding a gun to your head and I'm like, should I or shouldn't I, Kurt?
Well, and
But you see why this is such a weird hypothetical. This is so detached from our everyday experience of reality. You
Well,
see,
no, it's not actually. It directly connects to it. It's just a more direct example of what's happening all the time because my actions are always affecting you, and they're always affecting
Okay.
Katie, and they're always affecting Chris. Indirectly, they affect everyone. So it is the same. It is like I'm holding the gun to your head and being like, should I or shouldn't I, Kurt? It's just more indirect.
well,
Can we flip it? What's your definition of should to both Ariel and Chris?
let me. It's the same definition as yours. Like I'm just trying to.
No, I mean, I don't really have a definition.
I can
What's
answer
yours?
that. I'm willing to be in the hot seat if you guys want to do that. I'll be in the hot seat. I think.
Hang on. Can I just go back to what we were talking about? Really, just I had a thought and I want to get it out before it disappears.
Okay.
Kurt, you have your own morality and you have your own kind of things that you should do and things that you shouldn't do. And you said, well, I can't really tell other people what they should and shouldn't do. But I think you can't deny that imagine everybody else in your society is very immoral or completely doesn't agree with what you think about which things are good and bad. Would you really want to live in a society like that? Wouldn't you want to change people's behavior to be a little bit more like yours?
Probably.
Okay. So I think that's a good case for maybe you should tell people what they should do.
Okay, maybe.
Cool. All right. Ariel, back to you.
I suspect that there is a purpose to humanity. And in having these kinds of conversations where like we map out the possibilities, like there's two levels on which I'm thinking about all these possibilities we're mapping about. One is like how realistic those possibilities are, and one is how much I think those possibilities align with the purpose as I so imperfectly and intuitively understand it based on the readings I've done and stuff like that. And I'm not sure there's a purpose. There might not be, but I suspect there might be.
I don't suspect that there's an external purpose, but I would like for us to co-create one. And I have my own ideas of what I'd like it to be. So
like a shared internal
I do
purpose.
tend to like moralize and kind of like try to nudge people for things they should and shouldn't do all the time. But I don't think that there's like a higher should. Like an ultimate should.
Like sometimes you
I think
feel
there
like
might be. No, I think there might be an ultimate should.
Yeah, I
can elaborate if you want, but I'm not convinced. I think it seems hubristic to me to say that humanity is the ultimate arbiter of should.
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm definitely not saying that.
Well, humanity and animals, then? Like, what are you saying?
I'm saying that there is no. I'm saying that should is kind of a human concept, or well, maybe it's not a human concept. There might be other beings that have a concept of should, but I'm saying that like within our own context, we're the ones creating this concept of should. It's almost like like a sandbox video game where you get bored if you're just like running around the map doing nothing after a while. And okay, maybe we can all keep running around the map and doing nothing and there's like this destruction, or maybe we can go on our individual journeys and that's great. Or wouldn't it be really cool if we like constructed something together? And that would be awesome.
Okay.
But like it's not, there's no purpose to Minecraft, you know?
Okay, here's the thing. I don't think that morality is a human construction. I think at the very least, morality emerges from human biology, which is outside of our control. I think that's my, as far as I can see, that's the most consistent materialistic explanation for everything. And I think that might be the case. But I also suspect that there might be something that transcends us that we tap into somehow, or that our history, our biological and civilizational history is tied up in.
Well, and I think that both Eastern and Western religious traditions say something approximating that.
I am noticing that we're running out of time. Do we want to continue this for a bit, or are we happy to wrap up with some final statements?
I think this is a good place to wrap up.
I have a final statement. I'm not sure if that means wrapping up or having final statements. Seems like the same thing to me.
Okay, well, let's have some final statements from everyone, from whoever wants to make one.
So I've just been continuing my reading of The Way of the Superior Man by David Data. And basically he talks about masculine essences and feminine essences. And it seems to me that part of the core of the masculine essence is to have a purpose. And that's not necessarily part of the feminine essence. The part of the feminine essence is to have love and harmony. It seems to me that this kind of normative way of looking at things is more masculine, and this kind of descriptive way of looking at things is kind of more feminine. And so I think there's definitely value in both perspectives, but I think it's the interplay between the perspectives where that causes growth and meaning and wisdom.
I just wanted to say that when it comes to topics as deep as this, I think that likely 6 months from now, if I go back and watch this, I'll think that I said a bunch of things wrong, because it's really confusing even to me to try to articulate what does purpose mean? Do shoulds exist? I'm a person who, like, based on what Chris said, I would say that I'm a person who like has a very strong drive and purpose for love and harmony. And like, I definitely, anybody who knows me knows that I'm extremely moralistic. But it's not backed up by like a definitive moral framework. And that's kind of confusing and contradictory, but it's where it is. And so I think that, and I think I see a parallel in society's meaning crisis, where like, on the one hand, you have progressivism and all these ideals, and on the other hand, we've like ripped out the root of like this fundamentalist view of Christianity or God and right and wrong, and like people, you know, simultaneously believe in cultural relativism and all of these egalitarian ideals, and we're grappling with that. And I'm interested in seeing where it goes. Like, I've come to a place where I'm no longer just extremely uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean I've completely solved my meaning crisis.
So I really like the 9th episode of the Vervaeke speech, of Vervaeke lectures, where it's and the 8th, where he's talking about the kinds of meditation, and it reminded me of being in the temple, especially when he gives this finger example, and he's like, just look at it, concentrate it, and then later you look more closely and say, notice how it's slightly bent, and notice how there's knuckles, and paying attention to the different parts of it. And that was actually kind of a light bulb switching on for me when my monk friend said a similar thing to me about the nature of meditation. So I guess I had this idea for a long time that meditation was kind of meant to be something boring, and that misses the mark a little bit, because focusing on something can be boring, but there's also ways to make it interesting. So my friend would tell me, say he's breathing in, and he's breathing in deeply, and he starts to notice these different parts of the breath. So he starts to notice little eddies coming in his nostril, and the sensation along the throat, or the esophagus, all these kinds of things. There's all these different aspects of it. So tiny little things that are waiting to be explored, and it can lead you to joy. So that's a fun thing. So talking about should, it's an interesting idea. So there's this ancient idea about letting go of the need for things to be a certain way. And I think when we say should, it does associate with that concept. And that's part of why I'm so cautious about using that word. Is So this idea, like, I'm going to let go of my desire for a certain consequence, but I'm also going to strive for that outcome, even though I don't care if I actually achieve it ultimately, but I'm still going to put emotional effort into achieving it. And it seems like a contradiction, but it isn't. It actually makes perfect sense. And so we let go of this desire or this attachment to the outcome, and that's why I'm cautious about should. I remember looking at this mural or this painting in a Hare Krishna restaurant, and it shows, this is quite a famous painting actually. On the left, it shows people coming in, being born and then dying and being reborn, going through old age, and then perhaps being reborn as an animal. So in this Hindu perspective and Hare Krishna perspective, say if a human is very ravenous, if they eat a lot, especially eat a lot of meat, then maybe they'll be reborn as a lion or tiger. And if you sleep a lot, then you'll be reborn as a bear. Now, in a modern Christian way of thinking about this, you might think, oh, this is about sin. This is about like good things happening or bad things happening. And I guess that's how I thought about it originally. But now I would say, well, it's just a matter of natural consequence. It's what happens. I mean, not that it's necessarily like that's a weird scientific claim about reincarnation, but the point is that the separation of what should and shouldn't happen and just the consequences of one's actions.
The solution to the meaning crisis is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Okay. Thanks for watching,
Absolutely.
everyone. Thanks for watching this episode. Like, subscribe, join our Patreon, and so on and so forth. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us on the Multiversity. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversitypodcast.com.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.